Well, hello there, my friends, and welcome back. My name is Stephanie Safarian, and you're listening to episode 484 of Sustainable Minimalists. And on today's show, I'm bringing you a smorgasbord. It's a smorgasbord episode that's heavily focused on climate solutions. Now, I want to say at the upfront, this is not an easy breezy listening episode. I'll bring you one of those on Thursday to balance today out. So not an easy listening episode, but a must listen episode. This is for my advanced listeners who are really interested in climate solutions. Now, today's show, let me just set it up for you in terms of agenda, because usually on this show we cover one topic for 30-something minutes. Today is a little different. In the first half of my conversation today, we're talking climate action. What needs to happen for the world to finally mobilize and start acting like our home is on fire? What needs to happen? That's part one. We're also in part one discussing what my guest predicts the next 150 years are going to look like. Spoiler, it's not pretty, but my guest is optimistic. So that's part one. In part two, in the second part of today's show, we're discussing air conditioning. In our warming world, air conditioning is now a public health requirement, is it not? It's no longer a luxury. It's no longer nice to have. It's necessary to have. But what about running these things? Because as it gets hotter outside, our air conditioning units demand more energy to cool our homes. According to the United Nations, the world could use more than double the electricity it does now to stay cool, which of course potentially leads to more planet warming emissions. Are we in a feedback loop? And what do we do? That's part two. Today, I am speaking to a distinguished voice in the climate solutions movement, and I do mean distinguished. My guest is Michael Barnard. He is a self-proclaimed nerd who spends his time projecting scenarios for decarbonization 80 years into the future. Oh my goodness, yes. He does that for fun. He's also one of the authors of the new book titled Proven Climate Solutions: Leading Voices on How to Accelerate Change. That book, by the way, is out now. Michael, we have an awful lot to discuss today, and I am buckled up. I'm ready for it. How are you?
I'm very well, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be here.
I always like my guests to introduce themselves because I feel like they always do a way better job than I can do in 2 seconds or 2 sentences, let's say. So you take the floor. Who are you and what do you do?
I'm a nerd who just needs to know everything about climate change and solutions. And so I spent past 15 years overlapping with a global technology career, looking at every aspect of climate change, the scale and magnitude of it, the purported solutions, and assessing the solutions on the trifecta of, are they technically viable? Are they economically competitive with other alternatives? And will human beings accept them? And so now I do projections through 2100 of major areas like aviation, hydrogen demand, maritime shipping, steel demand, and most recently, concrete and cement for the built environment.
But how did you get interested in climate solutions in particular? Was there a defining moment where you thought to yourself, this is the arena I need to get into?
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, it was a long time ago. It was in the 80s. I was very focused on environmental concerns at the beginning of my technology career. And unfortunately, I was terrible at it in the sense that I was too passionate and didn't have this communication skills or the leadership skills to be able to find ways through that intensity to actually help people find better solutions. And so I, to a certain extent, set it aside for a couple of decades as I gained the experience and abilities I needed in order to make a difference. And so I returned to it, as I said, 15 years ago. And climate change is the biggest crisis that we have facing us. If we consider the major ones, we have population, and population growth is coming to an end 2050, 2070 now. That's great news. There's poverty, and we have fewer people in abject poverty than at any time, as a percentage, at any time in recorded history. And the number is going down every year. We have famine, and we actually currently manufacture a full third more food than we need. We just throw a third of it away, which is kind of stupid. So climate change is a very significant thing because it's going to impact everybody in one way, shape, or form. It's going to impact all of our economies. It's going to cause significant displacement of people internally in their countries and externally. And it's going to disrupt our living patterns and our infrastructure. There's places that we're not necessarily going to have to abandon, but we're going to severely diminish the number of people who live there, like Southern Florida, for example, or the Pacific Southwest, or the American Southwest. If we think over the impacts of the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015, that was 14 million people displaced. And the average number that people think are going to be displaced by 2050 is about 14 times that. So think of 14 times the magnitude. There's nothing that I can think of for me to do that is of greater merit. And if I can move the needle 0.001%, that's very useful.
You said two things there that really struck me. The first is you listed our big problems. Poverty is not going to affect everybody. It just is what it is. Neither is famine. But climate change is. It's going to affect everybody, perhaps not equally, but it will still affect everyone nonetheless. That's number one I wanted to just restate because that's important. The second thing you said that is fascinating to me is you said that as early as the 80s, you found yourself concerned with climate change. And I am going to say right here and now that I was born in the 80s, the early 80s, but still the 80s. And this is quite ignorant of me, but I did not know that climate change was even discussed in the 80s. I thought this was more of a conversation that started in the 90s. And now that I'm saying that out loud, I'm wondering if that's because that's, in the 90s when I was a teenager, that's when I started paying attention. But are you saying that as early as the 1980s, so 40 years ago, we knew that the way humans were consuming, the way humans were living was detrimental to the planet. And so then, by consequence, for 40 years, we haven't done much?
Oh, it gets better or worse, depending on how you look at it. So we isolated carbon dioxide as a gas, the primary greenhouse gas, back in 1830 or so. And in 1850, a female scientist actually proved that it was a greenhouse gas. She did the experiments and found that it absorbed and re-emitted infrared radiation, the primary mechanism of global warming. And so 1850, female scientist. 1890s, Arrhenius, a insanely intelligent scientist, actually did the calculations and figured out the math of global warming given our carbon dioxide emission. And he's pretty right. Then in 1972, Exxon's scientists said, by the way, everybody in our company, our product is causing global warming and it's serious. And so Exxon actually muzzled its scientists and immediately started to do disinformation campaigns in the 70s. In the 80s, we started seeing global attention to it and the formulation of the International Panel on Climate Change. It was formed in 1890, I think. In 1990 was the first Accord meeting and the first reports were coming out and stuff like that. So we've known about it for an awfully long time. Most sensible countries baseline their action plans from 1990. That was like the point where we all started to do it. And if you look at the graphs as I do, Europe is trending down in emissions by any standard since 1990. It's been took it seriously and it's been doing something about it. The rest of us, not so much.
Your new book, you're one of the authors of Proven Climate Solutions, Leading Voices on How to Accelerate Change. You are a leading voice of climate solutions. And so here you are telling me that starting in the 1870s, there was whispers about climate change. In the 1970s, Exxon is muzzling its scientists. In the 1980s, I believe you said, climate change, the threat of climate change was starting to become public knowledge. And now here we are in 2024. Are we going to do anything about this problem? Like, are we going to do anything substantial in your opinion and in your capacity as somebody who's been in the throes of it for your entire career?
Yes, so we will. And I like to tell people I'm optimistic for certain values of optimism. 1.5 degrees is in the review mirror. I don't believe we'll keep it to 2 degrees. I believe we'll come in around 2.5 to 2.7 degrees before we get the global thermostat under our control. And then we'll slowly draw down atmospheric CO2 probably to the 300 parts per million level. And then in 50,000 years, when we leave this interglacial period in the current ice age, the Holocene, in 50,000 years when the glaciers start coming back, we'll have our fingers on that thermostat knob and be able to turn it up to prevent glaciation from eradicating us as a species. But that's going to be an ugly process over the next century and a half, 2 centuries. When I talked about the number of people who are going to be displaced, we're going to see a lot of displacement. We're going to see a lot of infrastructure that we've built over the past hundreds of years become worthless because it doesn't have, it's now underwater, or it's in a place where people can't live, or it's oil and gas infrastructure. We have an awful lot of oil and gas infrastructure, far more of it than we need in our decarbonized world. But we have tons of solutions. Energy has been our biggest problem for climate. And the United States has already decarbonized its energy by shutting down coal sufficiently that now transportation in the United States is the biggest problem. And we have electric vehicles. When I look around the world, I look at China, for example, where 75% of its rail is electrified. They have 45,000 kilometers. That's about 32,000 miles of high-speed electric rail. That's really high speed, connecting all their major cities. And everybody takes rail because it's so much more convenient than flying. And then there's electric cars, which are incredibly fit for purpose. We're now at 67% of the Chinese market is purchasing EVs, up from 4% not that long ago. If we look at steel and cement and iron, major industrial sectors, a lot of that was driven since the 1990s by the growth of China, which was building all the infrastructure to become the manufacturing country for the world. Well, they're kind of near the end of their infrastructure build out. And so this year we're already seeing cement demand, steel and iron demand go down. We're seeing coal going down. China's going to turn very rapidly and start decarbonizing because they're building so much more solar than anybody else. They're building a third more solar than the rest, wind and solar, than the rest of the world combined every year. And so that major problem is becoming a major part of the solution. And we've got batteries are incredibly fit for purpose. They're doing very well. They're coming way down in price and engaging lots of efforts with investors and other people around what battery price, how cheap can batteries get, and what does that mean? As we look around the solution spaces, we've got major industrial sectors pretty much covered. We've got transportation covered. We've got energy covered. We're just going too slowly about putting in place the stuff that matters, in part because, back to Exxon, there's a big industry that's going away that really doesn't want to go away. And so they're trying to prevent their entire industry. And it's a set of industries too. You just know that the natural gas utilities are quite upset about this entire thing. They're trying desperately to preserve their gas pipelines and their customers. And heat pumps out of air conditioning, are eating their lunch.
We're going to talk about heat pumps, and I'm sorry to keep delaying this air conditioning conversation, but just one more question for you, because I have you and I know that you're so knowledgeable in this arena. What has to happen before we start acting as though our house is on fire? We're dragging our feet. Here in the United States, we have a presidential candidate yelling frack, frack, frack at his rallies. There's no fire under those who govern at the moment. So what do you envision happening to get the change moving?
The United States is a special case. I'll just say that outside of my head. It's trying to push its way in the outdoor. And what has to happen in the United States is what has to happen in every democracy, which is everybody who cares about climate change has to wake up and realize it. I'll just say Beryl went barreling through. It flooded Houston again. As a matter of fact, it flooded Toronto. It went all the way across the continent and basically flooded the major expressway in Toronto, the Don Valley Parkway, which was the Don Valley swimming pool yesterday with submerged cars and everything. It dumped water into our subways in Toronto. And so the more that climate change starts being impossible to ignore, and the more voters are impacted in negative ways by climate change, and the more we just keep pointing out the bleedingly obvious reasons that barrel was made as big and powerful and disruptive as it was because of climate change. You know, eventually we're down to the point where in the United States, as Michael Mann says in his latest book, The New Climate War, we're down to 9% of people who deny climate change even in the United States. It's that small a percentage. They're very vocal and are amplified by the fossil fuel industry. And in the United States, unfortunately, you've got the situation where in 1972, we had the OPEC oil crisis, and because the United States didn't make enough oil for itself, it was importing. Now, the United States is the biggest exporter of oil by far, 50% more than Saudi Arabia every year. It's now the biggest exporter of natural gas by far. And so the fossil fuel industry in the United States, instead of dwindling in economic significance, has maintained its 3 to 5% of gross domestic product by radically expanding production. Unfortunately, that means they have lots of power too. So, some of it is just that people are getting away from it. Because heat pumps are so much better than alternatives, they're taking heat pumps. Because electric cars turn out to be so much better than alternatives. Oh, I can get a Tesla, or I can get a BYD, or I can get another car. And they just find them. People who have electric cars typically don't go back. And there's more and more electric cars on the roads, and everybody's neighbor has an electric car now. So it's like everybody knows someone who has an electric car, even if it's a Ford Lightning or electric Hummer, which is the stupidest electric vehicle ever invented. The point is, it's a process. It takes time. I will say that the United States historically has produced more of the world's carbon dioxide emissions that are in the atmosphere than any other country or any other block of countries. China is the biggest emitter right now, but China is this year at peak. It was at peak gasoline last year. It was going to be at peak. It's at peak coal this year, and all the predictions for 2023 are coming true. It's 5 and 7% off coal demand on a month, May or in June basis compared to last year. China has electrified everything much more than the rest of the world combined. Europe is doing a great job, and Europe is putting in place a carbon price on the world with its carbon border adjustment mechanism, because Europe is the biggest trading bloc in the world. Like literally, they trade with everybody else in the world more than any other country. And so their carbon border adjustment mechanism means that everything that gets imported gets a fairly stiff carbon price, and countries and firms have to decarbonize to be competitive in the EU, a very rich trading bloc. So we're getting there. It just feels like in the United States, we're not. Like, I spent a lot of time with India, and India is very concerned with this. They built a huge amount of transmission and solar and wind energy, and they're they're electrifying their 2 and 3 wheel vehicles, or they've got a plan to get 50,000 electric buses on their roads by 2027 to go with the thousands they have. Places like Nigeria are buying 14,000 electric buses. 2-wheel vehicles in Africa are electrifying at a great rate. It's going to occur. In the United States, there's so much of bandwidth taken up by the people, the industries that are attempting to prevent transformation.
Yeah. As a American citizen, it almost seems as though, and I don't want to say we need, because that's not the right word, but it almost feels as though the extreme weather disasters must first occur before legislative change occurs. And I hate to say that, but we need a wake-up call here, and we haven't had it yet. All right, so we need to talk about air conditioning. I know offline before we hit record, you said it's been pretty darn hot in Vancouver. I'll just say here in Boston, we've been living in our house for 10 years now. And historically, if we turned the air conditioning on maybe 5 days out of the entire summer, that was a lot. And this year, we've had the air conditioning on all of July. It's just been that hot and humid. And so what I really want to talk to you about, Michael, is the air conditioning feedback loop. But before we do that, talk to us in real layman's terms. I don't know you in real life, but from what I know about you, I feel like you could give me a very scientific answer here. I want you to explain it like you're talking to a 5-year-old. How does air conditioning work, and why, from an environmental standpoint, is all of us using air conditioning all the time a potential problem?
Air conditioners are one-way heat pumps. And that's all a fridge is. A refrigerator is a one-way heat pump. It pumps heat from inside the refrigerator into the kitchen. An air conditioner pumps heat from your living room into the outdoors. A heat pump just adds a second cycle so that it can pump heat in the other direction too. So all a heat pump is a two-way air conditioner is one simple way to think about it. Yes, there are nerdy things about compression and condensation and stuff like that. But that's just the technology. There's stuff happening inside your walls and inside the boxes and stuff. So that's statement one. Statement two, though, depending on where you are, like I've been to Boston. I've been to Boston in the wintertime. I'm pretty sure you use your furnace in the winter more than you used your air conditioner in summer. And heat pumps actually are 3 to 4 times more efficient than your gas furnace. So while electricity demand goes up, the total energy demand goes significantly down because, once again, it's reaching out into the outdoors, cold, and taking heat from the outdoors and bringing it inside. It's just moving heat around with electricity. Very useful that way, very efficient. And in the summertime, the good news is modern air conditioners are just heat pumps. And once again, they're very efficient at moving heat from inside to outside. And so there is a demand concern because there's kind of 2 levels to this concern. One is, as we heat up, we're going to require more electricity to cool people down. As soon as it stays above 68 degrees Celsius for 2 or 3 nights, people start dying, especially in the upper stories of buildings and people who are at risk. Children, the aged, the infirm. There are places that they live just stay too hot, and we lose our ability to thermoregulate, and they die. And so that's unfortunate. 2 or 3 years ago in Europe, 61,000 people died in heat waves. Very significant numbers are now dying in heat waves. We had, in the big heat wave here in the lower mainland of British Columbia, we had 37 degrees Celsius heat, which is like 99 degrees Fahrenheit heat for a week. And we had hundreds of deaths. And so on the one hand, we need air conditioning just for comfort, but we need air conditioning as a public health requirement. And the amount of electricity they consume is a concern. But here's the thing about the electricity side of it. We're making a lot more of that electricity with wind farms and solar farms. And electricity made from wind and solar farms isn't a climate problem. It's displacing gas and coal. Increased air conditioner demand in the summertime means we're still burning more coal and gas than we need to. So it's delaying the electrification with renewables, but we're still hammering in lots of renewables. And so eventually we'll get to the point where we can cool everybody in the summertime and it's not a climate problem from the energy demand perspective. So public health requirement, especially for the bottom 20 to 40% of income earners who tend to live in places who tend to be energy impoverished, especially in the United States where the Gini index of equity is quite high, or at older buildings, old brownstones in New York that are just creaky. They can't afford to replace old air conditioners, which are no longer optimal. So there's a bunch of challenges around air conditioning, but it's a requirement. We need to make sure that we keep people, especially the most vulnerable among us. Like rich people can afford air conditioning and it doesn't even register. But if you're poor, that air conditioning bill can be a significant problem in the summertime. It's more the inequity side. Now, that's public health. That's electricity stopping being a problem because we keep adding more generation from wind and solar. And guess what? Solar is really well aligned with demands for air conditioning. We need air conditioning when it's hot and sunny, and solar really works for that. This third part, though, is I'll just talk briefly about this refrigerant. There's a gas inside the air conditioners and the heat pumps, and we compress it, and we do some other stuff with it. But that gas has properties that enable it to be used as a coolant, so we can transfer heat through it. Very nice. But a bunch of the stuff we use, hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs, they have really high global warming potential. When they leak, and air conditioners and heat pumps leak 2 to 4% of their gases every year. When they leak, the HFCs, the standard ones, they're 4,300 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of creating global warming. So there's a whole bunch of backstory here. You remember the ozone layer and Montreal Protocol, and now the ozone layer is healing itself, which some of those deniers are saying, well, there's never a problem, it was just hysteria, and no, we fixed it. This is an exact example of the world coming together and stopping doing the stuff that was bad. But we used to have CFCs, which were bad for the ozone layer, and incidentally were even worse for greenhouse gases. And then we replaced them with HFCs, which were better for the ozone layer, but still very high, bad for the climate, for climate change. And now we're replacing those with multiple things. Carbon dioxide, by the way, is actually a very common refrigerant now that we're using in various places, especially hot water heaters and industrial refrigerators. My local grocery store, the cheese counter, is now cooling the cheese with carbon dioxide. And ammonia is a common one that was used. Propane, believe it or not, is a very common refrigerant. Europe is going that way. And there's something called HFOs. They're much lower than the HFCs and CFCs as well. That's the direction that the United States is going. But everybody's just going to be changing air conditioning, gases that are inside fridges and freezers and air conditioners and heat pumps. So they're not a climate problem either. We're well on the way on that.
I just want to restate what I hear you saying. I hear you saying that air conditioning is no longer nice to have, but it's necessary to have in our warming world. I hear you saying that as we are electrifying everything, the energy concerns are not all that serious as compared to running these ACs on fossil fuels. I hear that. I also hear you saying that CFCs were replaced with HFCs, and HFCs are being replaced with other things, carbon dioxide being one of them. So the units themselves are also getting cleaner. But back to the electrifying everything for a minute. If we're running our AC units on electricity, is there concern, or should we be concerned with overtaxing our electric grids? Because the hotter it is outside, the harder our AC units have to work to cool our inside air. So overtaxing the grids and having mass hysteria as grids fail, is that something that me and my listeners should be concerned about?
Not particularly. Heat stresses grid. Ice storms destroy grids. If we think about the things that have caused major blackouts in recent years, it's been hurricanes and it's been ice storms. And I'll just say mad props to the people who run grids. We're all just used to plugging plugs into the wall and having perfectly formed electricity in the right voltage just there. It's so nice. It's such a privilege. And it's something that utilities globally are doing. In North America, we're not that great at it. The average person has a couple of hours of outages a year, unless you're in Texas, in which case you have 4 hours of outages a year on average. But in Europe, in Germany and Denmark, for example, there are 13 minutes of outages a year. There's nothing to prevent us from having that except our unwillingness to do the work that they've done to make our grids that resilient and strong. And so they do the projections. Everybody knows the weather is getting heavier. And they say, okay, what's our peak demand? How can we stop some of that demand? Like, here's an obvious one. Oh, we've got electric cars. Oh my God, that's going to add to the peak. No, because you just have the car charging at night when you don't need the air conditioning nearly as much. You need the air conditioning during the day. And you have lots of solar during the day to power lots of air conditioning. So you're just delivering electricity when it's needed in a very nice way to keep people cooler. And then we start seeing other demand shifting stuff, like we'll start putting grid storage on. And we're now at something called the duck curve in California, where there's so much solar that normal generation just disappears from the grid. And we have this belly of the duck. And then it ramps back up again as the sun starts setting and solar disappears. Then we have to turn on all the gas and coal generators and stuff again. But that's now the shoulders of the duck are being cut off by batteries, right? So the batteries are doing that. We're now seeing that we're going to actually use school buses in an interesting way, because school buses get used twice a day, right? They get used once in the morning and once in middle afternoon. Then they're done and parked. You just charge up the batteries in the electric school buses, and then you draw them down in the evening when there's peak demand. So school buses become batteries to help people run air conditioners. But even there's even more that's going on. The grid, as we know it, our distribution grid, what we all plug the wires that come into our houses are in the distribution grid. Well, the average developed world country has 50 to 60% utilization on our distribution grid. And because we've got all these demand management options now, electric cars and, heat sinks and stuff like that, we can actually flatten the demand curve. So instead of disappearing at night and disappearing during the middle of the day when there's solar, we flatten it and we take it up to 70 to 80%. So our distribution grid gets used more efficiently. So there's all sorts of ways to solve this problem. The United States got all sorts of solutions, all sorts of money. And so we're starting to see all these solutions starting to be applied. Now, retrofitting is not necessarily cheap. That's a place where, especially for, once again, the less advantaged in society, are going to need financial assistance to get some of these changes embodied. And there's a bunch of stuff the United States government is doing around providing funding for the less advantaged to get air conditioning. Does that answer your question adequately?
It definitely does, Michael. I want to just talk about how heat pumps fit into this conversation. And you don't know this, but my listeners know this. My husband and I got a bunch of quotes for whole home heat pumps, and they were, I'm going to use the word exorbitant, much beyond what we could afford. Basically, our heating system, it's still working, but it's going to need to be replaced. We also have an air conditioning unit that doesn't actually fully work, and it's from the 1980s. It also definitely needs to be replaced. So we thought to ourselves, let's replace the whole shebang. But the bill for the heat pump, the quotes for the heat pump were much more expensive than just replacing the individual units total. How could a heat pump help us stay cool in a warming world? But also, so two-part question, what do you say to the upfront financial costs that most of us, and frankly, I can't afford?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's part of the requirement for us to get past this, because you and your husband are doing exactly the right thing. You're saying, we have two technologies, we can replace it with one technology. And that is a lot cheaper than replacing, because you could get very silly with your existing technologies too. But yeah, the heat pumps are a bit more expensive. And that is like an electric car until recently, someplace where the government has a need to step in with incentives. But there's a second part. We need to put a price on carbon. We need to put a price on carbon emission and we need to decouple electricity prices from fossil fuel prices and make sure that they're affordable. So affordable electricity is one of the key things, because then you start getting into the total cost of ownership thing. As the gas prices go up, the electricity prices stay the same or go down. And because electricity is more virtuous than gas, then all of a sudden the fiscals change. You and your husband, a little spreadsheet or a calculator, and you go, oh, over 10 years, this starts to pay itself off. But the second thing is, there's just a volume question. I've lived in Asia. I've lived in Latin America. I've traveled extensively. And you know what I see everywhere in much of the rest of the world? I see heat pumps. You know what I don't see in North America nearly as much? Heat pumps. Because we haven't been buying them. If we don't buy a lot of them, the price per unit doesn't go down. Now, I will say that I just got a heat pump installed at my unit, because in Vancouver, we needed air conditioning a lot less than Boston did, but now we need air conditioning. And it was not cheap. It was probably $22,000 US for the full installation with drywall and all those things. But of course, that is actually $22,000 additional value for my property as well. So it's an investment in resale value of the property. And it's huge investment in peace of mind and comfort, things like that. But you guys already have those amenities provided. We didn't have one of the amenities, so it was necessary. You guys have an air conditioner. You guys have a furnace. You don't live in a place that prices fossil fuels. In Canada, I've done the math for this. So 2030, Canada's 2030 carbon price, it's much cheaper in most provinces to heat and cool your home in Canada in 2030 with electricity than with natural gas. And because we've got a carbon price, the way our carbon price works, and the way a good carbon price works, there's a couple of organizations in the United States trying to do this for the United States as well. It's a fee and dividend thing. So we pay the carbon price when we buy gas or buy natural gas or buy anything that has embodied carbon. We just pay a little extra for that just because it's in the supply chain. We don't really notice it, most of us, most of the time. But then every 3 months, we get a check from the government. They return the money to the citizens. And the poorer you are, the less gas, less emissions you have, and the more the check means to you, because it's a much bigger amount compared to your budget. If you're affluent, you spend a lot in carbon tax, but you don't notice because it's a relatively small portion. And you get a check for a few $100 and you go home every 3 months. That's not really a big addition to your budget. But in 2030, we're going to be at like $130 per ton of carbon dioxide in Canada. And everybody's going to be, people up to 60% of our population by income actually make more money off the carbon price than they spend on average. There's variances in there. So pricing carbon becomes important. Just like EVs, there needs to be an incentive. And just like EVs, you may have noticed that EVs are getting cheaper. That's because a lot more of them are being bought. A lot more people are manufacturing them. As we move forward, the American market will be flooded with these things, and all the vendors, it's actually the contractors, the installers who are the biggest problem. All the installers who just really don't want to deal with the mess, and really just want to sell you another furnace and another air conditioner to replace the ones you got and keep it nice and simple for them. They'll figure it out. I know one of the things we talked about as we were preparing for this was the new in-window units. There's a whole bunch of new in-window units and windowsill units, saddle units that are much more high design, aesthetically pleasing, great for apartments and condos, or much less ugly. Very good for renters. For us, because we own, we're getting installed. But if we didn't own, we wouldn't do it. So there's all sorts of more additional options coming around, and they are going to come down in price substantially. And the government still needs to help them because it's still a capital cost, and not everybody can afford the capital cost.
Thank you so much for all your insight, Michael. Before we say goodbye, I'd love it if you talk to us about the book that you had a hand in writing. It's titled Proven Climate Solutions, Leading Voices on How to Accelerate Change. And you, my friend, are a leading voice. Tell us what's in the book.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's a very positive book. B.F. Nagy, the person who pulled us together to write it, sadly, he passed earlier this year before the book came out. And so his son is leading the charge in terms of promotion and stuff like that. But B.F. Nagy has been writing about climate and environment for a couple of decades. He's been doing documentaries and films. He was very accomplished, and this has been capstone to his career. Now, he reached out to a lot of very positive, very forward-looking thought leaders like Bill McKibben and Mark Z. Jacobson, Robert Howarth, and Dr. Audrey Lee, and Kate Gartner, Lakshmi Begum, who dealt with subjects like air conditioning, like how we're going to deal with aviation. So there's solutions for all these things. And B.F. Nagy assembled an amazing group of people that I'm privileged to be on. So I am. Like people like Mark Z. Jacobson and Bill McKibben. Bill McKibben's been a hero of mine since the 80s when he wrote a book about 24 hours of television versus 24 hours of camping on a mountain, and just the things he learned and observed from those two 24-hour periods. And so it's a positive book. As I said, I'm optimistic. It's going to be some ugly stuff that occurs, but we're going to figure this out, and we will get there. And the book is for people who want some hope.
What a final word, right? We're going to get there. It's going to be ugly for a little bit, but we're going to figure this out. Michael, thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed every moment of speaking with you, and I wish you so much success. Thank you.
Stephanie, it's been a pleasure.
Listeners, that's a wrap. My friends, show notes are at mamaminimalist.com/484. And we do have an eco tip today. I'll say up front, it comes from me, and it's more of a tip, not an eco tip. But I came across this as I was perusing the newspaper, and I thought to myself, this is something I don't know, so perhaps my listeners don't know as well. Let's make it an eco tip. And my eco tip today is about properly cleaning our fruits and vegetables, because at many points along the production, the packaging, the chain, there's plenty places for our produce to catch bacteria like E. coli, like listeria. And if these bacteria attach to our produce, these bacteria will grow. So we can reduce our risk of foodborne illnesses by simply washing our produce the right way. Now, how do we do that? In my house, prior to learning this tip, I just kind of rinsed it under the faucet for a few seconds. Maybe I used my hands for a little scrub and I'm done. But apparently, according to the New York Times, we're supposed to be soaking our produce for 5 to 10 minutes in cool water, or even better, in a vinegar solution. So 1 part vinegar, 3 parts water. The vinegar will help loosen the grit, the dirt, perhaps even help get off any looming bacteria. One study showed that soaking before rinsing is more effective at removing bacteria than just rinsing alone. Now, some produce, like strawberries, they are soft produce. They will degrade if they're soaked. So just skip the soaking for soft produce like that and just rinse. But that's my tip. I hope it helps you in your own life. We will be back on Thursday, where we are discussing the clutter and mental health aspect. How is decluttering a great way to care for your emotional health? That's Thursday. I'll see you then. Reach out if you need me, and take care.